Moab? What's up, Moab? Woo! Who here is psyched on science right now? Oh my gosh, this is amazing. Moab, we love this turnout. You guys are the absolute best ever. Okay, so we are so excited for tonight's event. We have an incredible panel of scientists that are going to be talking to you about Mad Max, which is the best thing you can imagine. So we are part of Science Moab. Who's heard of Science Moab? Who knows of Science Moab? Yeah! So we have really exciting news. Science Moab is now officially its own nonprofit organization. So cheers to everybody who supported us and come out to the events and everything. We just can't thank you enough for all of this. We're just super incredibly psyched. We want to thank KZMU for their continued and unending support and the helipad. How about this space? Isn't this the best? Yes, helipad. We also really want to point out that we're psyched that we can offer these events for free because we really feel like access to science, especially the science that's going on in our backyard, should be free. Can I get a hell yeah to that? So because of that, I'm also going to be passing, so we can ensure that it's free for everybody and into the future, I'm going to be passing around this, and it's only for people who feel like they can make a donation, and if you've already made a donation for stickers or whatever, great, you can pass it on, but if you do make a donation in this bucket, make sure you take a sticker, because we have these amazing, there are only 100 of these in the world. In the whole world. They were designed and made entirely by Laurel Hagen. Can we get a round of applause for Laurel? So you definitely want to grab these if you have not already as you put some money into this awesome bucket. I'll give it to you here. Okay, so we are so chrome for tonight's event. No? Nobody? Come on, Mad Max, we are super excited. We have an amazing, yes! So we have an amazing panel of scientists that are gonna be talking tonight. So we're gonna be watching some great clips and then we're gonna hear from these amazing scientists talking about what they know and how it relates to how messed up Mad Max's world is. So I'm gonna introduce each of these scientists so you can know a little bit about them. Right here we have Russell McCallister. Russell is the Moab Federal Cleanup Director for the Department of Energy Moab Uranium Mill Tailings Remediation Action Project. Whoa! Nailed it! Better known as UMTRA, better known as the large tailings pile north of town. So we're really psyched to have Russell here and hear what he has to say about what's going on down there. Next, we have Mike Duniway. Mike is a USGS scientist here in town. He's a soil scientist who focuses on soils and soil processes in dryland or desert ecosystems. He's been in Moab on and off for how many years is it, Mike?
What year is it, 2020?
For a while. He's been here for a while, so we're psyched to have Mike on the panel. Next we have Travis, who is also Travis Nauman, who is also a USGS scientist here in town, and he studies the role of soils in ecosystems and how soils respond to global change, which is a lot of what we'll see in Mad Max's movie and a lot of what is going on in the world around us now. And then finally we have, we had Jane Belknap was unfortunately unable to make it. But we have somebody just as good. We have somebody just as good. She's arguably better, Natalie Day. Yes! She's a hydrologist at the, she's a hydrologist here in town, and she's been in Moab for over a decade. Natalie and I were technicians together at the USGS starting in 2010. So she's been around. We've been doing science in this community for a long time. So we're really psyched on this panel. They're amazing. And I think it's time to to see our first clip of Mad Max. Who's ready? Yeah. All right, cue it up. Whoa. It looks rough out there. All right, for those who have not seen the movie before, who's seen this movie before? Not everybody. Okay, so for those who haven't seen it, that's our guy. That's Max, also known as Mad Max. All right, so Mike, I want to start with you. Is the mic on? So Max called where he was a wasteland, but that, to me, that looked a lot like a desert. And so could we talk about why deserts are sometimes inaccurately, in my opinion, considered wastelands?
Yeah, sure. Is this working all right?
Take it off.
Yeah, I mean, I meant to do some homework and rewatch the movies, and I didn't do that. But that looks terrible. Yeah, I mean, I think the conception of deserts as wasteland comes from, either the lack of value that people have seen in them historically, or they're not wanting to see value in them. Those of us that live in Moab don't view them as wastelands because we had, the time here and to enjoy them, and having a little air conditioning helps a bit to make them not feel so oppressive. But if you're on expeditions coming to the west to learn about the desert, you can't grow crops here as you typically can in wetter environments, and so they're not as productive for agricultural uses. And before air conditioning and stuff, some places were very difficult to live in, and so they would feel very oppressive. And then most of the population is in greener, wetter places, and so this just doesn't look like someplace they'd want to be. But with more time too, we're also learning the value of them for things other than just recreation. I mean, recreation is a relatively new concept to do in deserts, but even other uses like their importance for global carbon storage has become more, has been new light shed on that. Their importance for energy balance for the earth. Big chunk of the earth is actually deserts, and so the reflective nature of those deserts is important for the global energy balance. And then other things that we think about that we'll be talking more about would be like soil conservation. So whether that's redistribution of the soils locally, that it will be negatively impacting people in the environments, or dust coming from our deserts, and going to other places, whether it's cities or mountain snowpack and other things that can have impacts beyond them. So I think, with more time and appreciation, so all the important work the desert naturalists have done for improving our understanding of them, as well as the science sort of recognizing the importance for people and society, even if you don't value them for the nature of them.
Awesome. Mike, I'm going to ask you another question. So let's talk about the fact that there were almost no plants. Did anybody notice that? There were almost no plants at all in Mad Max's landscape bed. Cannot be good. And so, Mike, let's say that area used to look a lot like the desert we have here in Moab. Let's say, Moab's a semi-arid desert with, 250 centimeters of rain per year, about, is that right? Yep. So millimeters, not centimeters, whoa. Millimeters of rain. Not a lot of rain, not that much rain. What kind of things would need to happen to turn a desert like the one we have here in Moab into a desert like where Max is?
Can I pass? I don't really.
Broadly speaking,
I don't really want to think about that. Broadly speaking, so in deserts, semi-arid or arid ecosystems, most of the massive transformations that we've seen, so think like Dust Bowl in the high plains, have happened with a combination of either fire-type events or just poor planning policies. So the Dust Bowl was greatly driven by poor policy from DC, combined with drought. And so those two things together tends to be where we get crosswise. And so for around here, we had a lot of that happen more with sort of the big, extensive cattle operations that happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s before the Taylor Grazing Act, where there was just no limits on the number of cattle. The numbers would have been astounding to any of us in here, and there have been big reaches of the desert Southwest that have been transformed by sort of some of those poor management or policy decisions combined with drought. And the other thing where we see that is with wildfire. So for example, Milford Flat, I don't know if any of you guys have been to Milford Flat after the Milford Flat fire in 2009 or 7. that landscape looks like Mad Max in the lower elevation places where it burned. Then they had a tremendous sort of dry spell. And then they, in their efforts to try to fix things in the very low elevation, they turned it into a dust bowl because of sort of poor planning or not understanding what they were doing on some extent on some of the lower elevations. So those two together. So dry conditions that make things really difficult combined with sort of either unfortunate events like fire or poor policy or management decisions.
So you touched on, things like grazing, a lot of animals, or things like fire. How about like big scale changes in like things like climate? Could that have any way of transforming a desert into something that's a little bit more degraded?
Yes, probably not on its own, right? So with here, the climate change forecasts are not super encouraging, right? So the forecasts for warming are pretty robust. We're likely to get warmer and consistently. And warmer means drier, even if the precipitation doesn't change just because of the atmospheric demand. And then the part that'll go with what I was just saying before is there will likely be, there'll be more climate variability, which means greater extended periods of drought. So we've experienced a lot of big droughts here in Moab in the last 20 years. So more like that. And then when you're in those sort of climate scenarios where things are really dry, the line between being okay and maybe causing catastrophic change gets to be a lot narrower, right? So you have less sort of room for error. So those two together. I think if we all left, and the desert was all left to its own, and there's climate change, we'd have erosion and stuff would happen, but it's the combination of sort of our activities on the landscape combined with those climate forecasts, those climate changing that are likely to make things transform quickly.
Any other panelists have anything to add to that question before we move on?
I guess I would just add that although I think deserts are definitely misconceived by a lot of people as wastelands, they're very diverse. And that ranges from the barren, from like Atacama in South America to the Sahara. And so there is barren desert out there. There is a grading of deserts, and we're kind of in this like semi-arid kind of pivot point of drylands here. And the thing is, though, is that when we like shift to climate balance and shift disturbance regimes, with our impacts, that can shift what the distribution of that is across the world. And so there is the potential to create more Mad Max environments based on pushing the climate a certain direction, which we're doing right now, and our actions on the ground. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to fill you in on what happens next in the movie. So after his car crash, Max gets taken, and he gets taken to a compound in the desert that is ruled by a really gross-looking dictator who hoards resources and makes people fight for him. And one of these fighters is a woman named Furiosa, and she's stolen the dictator's favorite possession, which are his women. And he's been keeping them enslaved, and it's pretty messed up when you describe this movie out loud. And so the dictator's figured out that Furiosa has taken his women, and he has sent a war party out after them. And Max is being used as basically a blood donation bag by one of these members of this war party called the War Boys. And because he's like new blood, fresh blood. And this guy who they're using Mad Max's blood because this war boy is dying of exposure to radiation. So he's dying of some kind of cancer, and so he needs new blood. And so now we have the war party setting off to bring back these prized women that Furiosa took. And you'll recognize Furiosa by her black makeup over her eyes. Whoa. That's crazy stuff. That's a lot of Jeeps not staying on trail. Natalie, I want to turn to you. Were they busting crust in that image?
They were definitely busting the crust in that. I think Furiosa was staying on the road, and she was taking out her anger on all those little buggies. Which sometimes I want those booby traps set up around the desert. That'd be kind of nice.
Driving, hiking, biking, or doing anything off trail around here is kind of considered like a jailable offense in some cases. And I want to talk about why that is. Like, what is this don't bust the crust idea? Like, what's actually going on when you disturb the soil? Like, okay, you're busting the crust, right? But what's actually happening when a vehicle track goes over, and why is that really a problem?
Well, first of all, I don't know if you guys are all aware, but Moab has the best crust in the world. We really do. We really do. We're not at a pivot point for having the best crust. We have the best crust here. It's amazing. It forms tiny pinnacles of crust that's amazing to look at. And when you disturb it, it can have really long-lasting effects. So in general, when crust gets disturbed, it stirs up the crust and exposes the crust, all the little organisms. What are the organisms? Bacteria, cyanobacteria, lichen, moss. Okay, good. It disturbs all those organisms, and it leaves them exposed to things like wind and water. And biocrust organisms are poikilohydric. Fancy word. Say it with me. Poikilohydric. You can say that now and teach people about it. So that means that they are able to live without water. So they're essentially dormant all summer until they get moisture. So the only time they can really grow is when they have extended periods of moisture, which happens during fall monsoons, if they happen, or during the winter when they're covered in snow. So if they get disturbed when it's hot and dry summertime, they have no chance to recover. They're just sitting there and can get blown away in the first wind event or rain event. And even if they do have a chance to recover, let's say it rains right after they get disturbed and they have a chance to grow, sometimes the soil is so messed up they can't tack themselves down anymore. And so that varies by disturbance. There's vehicle track disturbances like giant oil and gas trucks that you cause massive compression of the soil. So you can imagine that it would be hard for organisms to get into that soil and tack themselves down. But also things like cattle or people footprints cause a different kind of disturbance where it might just make the soil unstable and more easily blown away. I think that's all I wanted to say about that, yeah.
Can I ask one follow-up question to that?
Sure.
How long does it take to come back after a car drives over it?
Oh, God. That's the number one question I get asked. And the answer is, it depends. Sorry, there's not a magic number. If a tourist asks me, I say 200 years. Just say it, lie, say something, say really long time, don't step on it. But it really depends on the soil type, how much water it gets. That's like asking, how long does it take a tomato to grow? And it would be really different if you planted a tomato in a shady spot in your yard that never got water versus a nice sunny spot that got water all the time. It would take different amounts. And it's the same for crust. So, you know, next time you go out, next time you're in a canyon, there's lots of canyons around here, notice the north aspect and the south aspect and how the crust community is different. It will be different. It'll be more lush on the north-facing slope because it gets more moisture and less sun, less direct sun, so there's more moisture. And so if an area got disturbed where there's not a lot of moisture, it'll take a lot longer to recover.
Awesome. Mike, when we think about these different disturbances, so like vehicles versus grazing versus, you know, whatever is busting the crust, which is the worst? Like, which causes the most amount of disturbance and dust loss in a system?
So we have done a lot of work looking at this, measuring like the amount of sediment that's going horizontally. So like if you had your screen door open, like how much sediment would come in your screen door. And so we have good numbers that we've done, and lots of other folks have done similar measurements. And there's two kind of really interesting aspects to whether you're looking at like if you compare it like really undisturbed places, so places in the park where you have no real major surface disturbing land use, and compare those kinds of preserve areas to different levels of surface disturbance, it's hugely variable, but then there's a consistent trend where almost every kind of land use knocks it up by an order of magnitude, so 10-fold more, depending, and there's lots of variation around the mean. And that is because, I mean, for soils to get eroded, you need to let the wind get down to the soil surface, right? So if the wind is up high and you have a putting green, the wind doesn't get in there and move sand. It doesn't matter if you have biological soil crust on the putting green or not, because there's 100% grass cover, right? And so you start getting bigger gaps like we have here, and then that's when things like what Natalie is talking about, where it matters more. So if you have big gaps and you have great biocrust, like the nice pinnacle crust that Natalie was describing, that wind can get between the plants and get down to the soil surface and have enough speed to lift up soil particles, right? But the crust is has them all glued together, and so it doesn't matter that much that there's not that much plant cover. And so that's why before we were talking about climate change, in terms of massive transformation like we see in Mad Max, you need to lose the plants and lose the soil, right? And so with climate change, we're going to be losing some of our plants, and the plants are going to be smaller, but if we still have good soil crust and things holding the soil in place, the crust will continue to do their job and hold the soils in place. But once you lose your plants, and the wind can really get down there and pick up sediment, and then your soils that's hitting are loose erodible material like we saw in the film there, that's when stuff really starts taking off. And so some of the places where we have measured the biggest sort of sediment movement is off-highway vehicle places. So Travis did some work looking, we had these samplers out at Factory Butte for a number of years, and it was some of the highest numbers ever. But just because there's OHVs everywhere, and there's loose soil, and there's no plants, and so the wind can get right down there and pick up sediment. And then the other place that our colleague Mark Miller measured them was following that Milford Flat Fire, where there was, just because of the drought and the fire and all the equipment that went out there to try to restore it and save it, they had just incredible amounts of sediment. It looked like the movie, really. And then other things like overgrazing, improper grazing can elevate it, 10-fold, 100-fold. Oil and gas developments typically increase it by 10 or 100-fold. And then we had other kinds of land treatments in there too. So it varies. But if you can do it, land uses where you remove the vegetation, break up the soil, those are the worst in terms of the sediment production.
You mentioned oil and gas. We have a lot of kind of new roads and gas pads that are being, built in our region, and they get abandoned. They're not used forever. And so, Travis, I wanted to turn to you and ask, once those roads and those pads are built, and then what kind of reclamation happens after they're abandoned, and how effective is that reclamation and trying to put the plants and soil back together after they're used up?
As you might imagine, I'm going to say that it depends a good bit on a lot of things. So there's kind of part of it is understanding the story of a well pad and development of a well pad, and that so a company gets a lease and they put down what's essentially a deposit if it's a public agency saying that, okay, here's money against me screwing this up and not being able to reclaim it. And so then they go through this process, and they basically, to develop an oil or gas pad, they're going to level it and strip it basically clean, sometimes to bedrock, and store that material that they strip kind of off-site. And it kind of has varied over the years. In the past, they wouldn't really think as much about the reclamation. And so in the 2000s, more best practices started coming out. And one part about oil and gas is, so we have 90,000 plus oil and gas pads around just the Colorado Plateau alone. And so this, even though they're small little chunks of land, this adds up to a large land management, kind of issue. And so what happens is that, through time, more standards have been implemented, but technology has also kind of gotten a lot better, and so the pads have gotten bigger because like people are doing like stuff like fracking and horizontal drilling, and so there's kind of this dichotomy where because it's a shifting target and because energy development kind of blew up after mining development, because mining is actually much more tightly regulated than oil and gas. Like we don't really know as much about how well oil and gas reclamation has panned out because of all these moving targets. But what we can say from kind of broad scale analysis is that the main goal in these policies is site stability, which is essentially saying, okay, we just don't want this site to blow away, and then we want to kind of get to a point where we think it's on the right track towards restoration. So there's a lot of latitude that is given to whoever is making that call to determine that. And even myself, as somebody who's like, spent way too much time diving into the weeds of that, I'm not going to be able to tell you when I go to a site, this is the probability of reclamation of this site. And so you can imagine that like in an understaffed environment, which is generally what happens in natural resources monitoring, like people are making decisions without having all the information they really need. And so in general, what has happened is that most of the sites that we've kind of in different studies in the science community have looked at, it takes sites just to get to a stability point from an erosion perspective, decades to get there. And then if we're talking about true ecological restoration, thinking about plant community, thinking about what the soil should look like, thinking about what crust should look like, it's going to be 50 plus years. But that all is also dependent on the ecological setting and soil you're in, because it's super complicated. And so some soils, like if you're in saline soils, are just going to respond poorly to almost anything you do. And dryland restoration is a super complicated field, and we haven't really figured it out yet. So to bring it all back together, it's a really mixed bag, and for the most part, these sites are, in large part, kind of still in pretty bad shape.
Yeah, so to talk a little bit about the history of when the Mad Max movie started out with the thermonuclear holocaust, and that was the fear back in the day, back in the 50s, and that's why the project that I work on, the UMTRA project, exists, because back in the day, the Cold War was a fear that was real, and we needed all the uranium we could get our hands on to build nuclear weapons, and whether or not now we agree with that policy or not, that was a policy. So I've got a big pile of tailings out there that we are trying to clean up, and I've got a finite period of time, and exactly right, but when my job is done, when the tailings is gone, I don't know when the project will be done, because it's how long is it going to take to bring it back and to the type of terrain that was there before the tailings existed. So within 10 years or so, hopefully the tailings is gone, but I don't know when the site that we're working on now is going to look like the site, the areas out here that are native and beautiful. Oops.
It's often a question of money, like how much money they're willing to spend. And as Travis was alluding to, the way that oil and gas is permitted and bonded, and sort of the level of responsibility and the amount of money they can ask the agencies to actually spend is different than, say, for a Superfund site or for a coal mine. And so they often don't have enough sort of resources or money to, if you had enough money, you can make anything look great, right? You could go out there and water and do all kinds of stuff, but typically they're trying to figure out how much they can get done for a relatively small amount of money in the world of oil and gas.
And lots of amazing restoration scientists are working on fixing and making this all great, so don't get too depressed. Okay, so Mad Max. So there is a ton more crazy driving and a lot more crust busting going on. And everyone is still chasing Furiosa in her big badass truck. It's pretty badass. And then they notice something in front of them that is definitely going to be a problem. That was a haboob. That is literally what that's called. Mike, what is a haboob? And what causes it? And is that what they are actually like?
That's exactly what they're like. What was the word they were called? What were they calling it?
I don't know what they were calling it, but I know that it's called a haboob. I'm not just making that up.
No, I know you were, but they had like some name. They're like, anyway. So haboob is a great word, and we'd like everybody to say it. 1, 2, 3. Louder. Right. It's just a big dust storm, right? And so it's, I think it's a term from the Middle East. It kind of became popular during maybe the last 10 years or something in the press. It's like the idea is that it's a big, persistent dust storm, typically caused by some kind of weather front. For us in the Southwest, are often associated with monsoons. And the idea is that it's describing a phenomenon that can go for miles, and you can't see anything, you can't see your hand in front of your face. It's got zero visibility. So I guess it wasn't totally accurate. But and you know, they have been an occurrence in the Southwest for a long time. I mean, there are environments that are naturally dusty and eroded. So like dry lake beds and sort of soils associated with dry lake beds and riverbeds and stuff. So for example, those of you that have driven on I-15 between Tucson and Las Cruces, there's a big section of road there where it has lots of dust storm warnings, and a lot of that has to do with those dry lake beds being naturally dusty places. Not always, but to some extent. And then they've been in the news more, I think, in the Southwest because of areas around Tucson, and a lot of that has to do with the two things that cause dust, which is losing your plants and having erodible soils. And so when you don't water your cotton and you get rid of your cotton and you have fallow fields, those are big dust sources. So a lot of those big dust storms around Phoenix are probably associated with that kind of dewatering of agricultural land to give Tucson and Phoenix more water. And you know, we do get things like them here. We haven't had anything like the haboobs of Arizona yet, but we have. If any of you guys have seen some of our dust cameras on the CNHA website, so CNHA has webcams, and some of those are ours that we use for sort of evaluating dust events. And so we have caught some great ones in Indian Creek. You can see them a little bit from iSky, but we have them occasionally here. But you know, potentially with drying, we could expect more of that. You know, visual resources are a big reason why people come here. So visual resources meaning the beautiful sights, right? And so if you come here, you want to see the beautiful sights of Canyonlands, you're out at Grandview Point, and you can't see because it's dusty, it's going to be an issue, right? And so that's something that could be an increasing concern for tourism and the park managers and other folks here.
Why do we have them here? You described like fallow fields in southern Arizona, but do we have dry, like are they a natural feature of our region, or why do we have haboobs and giant dust storms in our area?
You know, we don't have big natural dust sources around here, right? Do we? I don't think we do. Most of it's more in the Basin and Range province where you have more of the playas and stuff. And so the reason we have dust here, it's not totally certain. You can link it. Travis has done some great work linking it to dryness and overgrazed areas. There is some awesome work. So done in the San Juan Mountains, where the lakes in the San Juans are like these recorders of the dust history of dust coming off the Colorado Plateau. So you can dig down into the lake beds and you can count, date the sediment deposits in there, and you see this huge spike in sediment in the San Juan lakes from around 1860, which is when the Transcontinental Railroad came out. And we had like big, large-scale livestock production, because before the Transcontinental Railroad, you couldn't get your livestock to the Chicago or Kansas markets. And so there's this huge spike that's associated with us, most of us that are in this room, coming out here and grazing cattle and stuff. And so that's a pretty clear signal that it didn't used to be this dusty. But it's not like you can't say, you and your parcel are making it. It's just kind of a diffuse use from a lot of different places.
Natalie, I want to go to you. What are some of the large-scale consequences of the fact that we have more dust in our area, and where is that dust kind of ending up?
So the dust can blow nearby. It can settle in nearby water bodies or landscapes, but as Mike said, it can also travel really far to like alpine regions, the mountains. If anybody's a skier or goes up into the mountains around this time, March, April, oftentimes, especially during dry years, there can be a lot of dust on the snow. And when there's dust on snow, it's called a dust on snow event. Yeah. It's a thing, DOS. It's got an acronym. Anyway, these dust on snow events are really interesting. If you've never, it's hard to see from here, it just looks like snow. But when you go look at dust on snow, you can see that, you can see that it's darker. Snow is white and bright. If I wear a white shirt, it's more reflective than a black shirt. So when snow has dust on it, it gets darker, which makes it melt faster. And this is happening for sure in along the Colorado River Basin. There's more dust, and during dusty years, the snow can melt way faster, and that means that soil, the regular soil, is exposed earlier than it normally is. And so that means there's more water loss from the soil, evapotranspiration. And so it means that there's less water ending up in the river. And so during really dusty years, like 2009, 2010, scientists found that there was around 5% less water going into the Colorado River. 5% may not sound like a lot, but it's a lot if it's a big number. So 5% is like the annual allocation that Las Vegas gets. So it's a lot of water. It's like all the water that Las Vegas gets. That can be lost if it's a really dusty year. And it can also make the snow melt come off earlier. So I already said that, but I want to reiterate that in addition to making less water, it also makes the snow melt come earlier. So down here, most of us are concerned with when are we going to get to hit the daily or whatever rapids, and that can happen a lot earlier during dusty years. So we'll see what happens this year. Now is the time to start looking for dust storms and see what happens to the stream flow.
Russell, I want to turn to you. We've probably all seen it driving on a dusty day. Some of the dust in our area is potentially coming off of the tailings pile that we have north of town. Can you tell us, if I'm right, if there is dust coming off the pile, and if so, how much? And kind of what's in that dust, and how do you determine that?
Okay, yeah, certainly dust does come off the pile. We take every mitigation that we can possibly to keep it down as much as we can. And we use water. Water trucks is probably our biggest way of suppressing dust. But because it is mill tailings, there is a constituent of radioactivity, and it's pretty low because in the process of tailing for the uranium, they took out most of the good stuff. So what we're left with is tailings, and it's pretty benign relative to radioactive material, but there still is some there. So basically, it is the material that was mined from around here, processed, and then it was slurried up to a tailings pond. So what we're left with is this big pile of, I just call it dirt. I mean, I don't really differentiate it between the dirt that's blowing around versus my tailings. Although it does have some radioactivity, there's a lot of natural radioactivity in this area, so we need to be cognizant of that. So we do hoodoo. But we do have monitoring all around the sites. We do basically look for radio particulates. We do dust monitoring as well. But as far as quantitatively saying how much dust is coming off the pile, I don't really know. Certainly it's not like that video. We don't have those kinds of clouds coming off the site. But people have come by and they do notice dust, and we try to forecast or look at weather reports for the next coming day to try to understand where the weather might be changing and where we need to get our water trucks out there earlier or later. So we do everything we can. We also try to curtail the amount of truck movements on a windy day, and it's one of those. As a project director there, I have a hard time doing that because the sooner we clean up the pile, the sooner we won't have dust from the pile. So every day I can't roll those trucks is one day farther on the end of my project. So again, we don't want to stir up any more dust than we can. We're doing everything we can to mitigate that. We have looked at surfactants and those kinds of stuff. But if you notice the pile, and if you live here and you go by it constantly, we're moving material all the time. We're either drying it and we're digging it up, and we're loading it into the containers and all. So there's a lot of mechanical movement that goes on, and we have to have for safety reasons too, we have to not focus in one area, so we spread the trucks out. And these are big trucks. I mean, these are big, heavy iron out there. So we're trying to look at the whole meal tailing pile as one entity and move material around as much as we can. Let's see, what else did you ask? I think that's what I got for that.
Okay, so spoiler alert, everybody survived the haboob. And Furiosa, the women, who she, also spoiler, is actually leading to freedom. And Max have all teamed up against the dictator after what they've put them through. They all got together. So they kind of keep driving. They bust a lot more crust. They have some insane car battles. You should watch the movie if you haven't seen it. And they're traveling across the desert trying to find this place called the Green Place, which is where they're going to be safe. But now they find themselves contending with another natural element out on the landscape. This time it's mud and salinated water. Yuck. Oh man. That's really disappointing. Travis, I want to start with you. I want to talk about the relationship between water and what's going on the landscape. It's not something we always think about, what's going on in our desert and how that maybe relates to what's going on in the water. So, Travis, does what's happening on the landscape influence what you get the kind of sediment and what ends up in the riverways and waterways that we have in our area?
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, there's like, I'll kind of keep this, it's a big question. There's like a lot of things that could play into what gets into surface waters. So I'll like think about the Colorado River Basin because it's, our home here. So there's a couple things. I mean, obviously there's like erosion concerns. We've talked about erosion a lot tonight. And there's kind of debates about what are the major drivers of erosion. We definitely have an accelerated erosion kind of dynamic on the plateau right now. There are kind of three broad categories, I would say, as to kind of the drivers to that. There's kind of conflict in the literature. Grazing is one of them, climate change is one of them, and then we have to overlay that in kind of the erosional environment that we live in. I mean, Chris Benson gave a great overview of kind of the erosional landscape that we live in and the amount of cutting that happens here on the Colorado Plateau. And so those are difficult drivers to kind of tease out, and a lot of those sediments end up in the river. But the other caveat to that is there's actually a lot less sediment in our river systems today because of dams. And so it's maybe like there's kind of, if there's one trade-off, is that like we actually kind of want more sediment in our rivers from like a geomorphic perspective and thinking about the health of our river system. So that's kind of like one side of things. But then when we think about kind of some of the allusions to what was being talked about in the scene, salinity is also a big issue in our river system, and we've had kind of political conflicts with our neighbors to the south over this. We have a lot of salinity that gets into the Colorado River. Again, it's a dichotomy between we live in a region that has a lot of salts. It's in our geologies, our geologic materials that kind of make up the landscape. But it's also, there's things we do that accelerate that. And again, there's a debate between people who think that erosion is a big contributor to kind of more salinity that we used to have. But the big one that has come out in the literature is irrigated agriculture. It tends to be, estimates in kind of recent studies range from about 12% to up to a third of the salinity that goes down the Colorado River is a result of irrigation, mainly flood irrigation, and mainly the main source of that is in saline-rich soils that are generally actually pretty popular for agriculture if you manage them right. Think about the Grand Valley, Grand Junction, the Maine Coast soils there. So Maine Coast shale and a lot of the other shale formations we have that make up a lot of agricultural soils have a lot of salinity, so people irrigate with that. It gets generally pushed into kind of shallow groundwater tables, that ends up in rivers. And so the lesson that we need to kind of remember from that is that there are broad parts of human history that have been dictated by salinization. We think about the Fertile Crescent, we think about Iraq and and kind of the desert landscape there. That, at one point, that was a cradle of civilization and agriculture, much more so than it is now. It's complicated, but so that's one of the big concerns that we have to think about in the Colorado Plateau with how we manage our landscapes, and what we do is kind of balancing how we manage our landscapes. And there are solutions. I don't want to paint a picture of irrigated agriculture as absolutely terrible. One of the big investments that have been made over the last few decades is switching from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation, because you can kind of keep the soils just below where your rooting zone for where you're growing crops, but not put so much water into the soils that it flushes into the rivers. So long-winded answer to some of the different things that end up in our Colorado River system.
Thank you, Travis. Russell, I wanted to turn to you. I'm curious about the relationship between the tailings pile and water, and how much of that material from the tailings pile has kind of ended up in our waterways, and how, if any, and how is that being addressed?
Very little of the tailings dust actually ends up in the Colorado River. We do monitoring, and we haven't seen any kind of elevated levels. But the relationship between the project and the Colorado River is substantial. I mean, that when the tailings were finished, when the mine closed down, the tailings were capped. So back in the day, they were kind of capped so they wouldn't have dust erosion and dust emission and all that stuff. So it was mainly the downstream constituents of the Colorado River that really dictated to Congress and company that we clean up that site. So it's kind of ironic that if it wasn't for the Colorado River, potentially that tailings would still be there and still be capped. So the other way that the water really impacts our site is it's a lot of dynamics that these gentlemen and ladies know more than I, but so we have several ways of dust suppressing. We use water directly from the Colorado River. We also have extraction wells, and the extraction wells take water that's very saline, like it was mentioned here, and that has a different effect on dust suppression. It actually, when you use that water, it actually forms a semi-crust. So having that saline water, and we are extracting it for contaminants. That's the main reason we're doing it, but it's beneficial that it has a lot of salts, because it actually acts as a dust suppressant. So during the wintertime, when we have less efficiency in extracting water, we use fresh water from the Colorado River. And that kind of does the opposite. It creates more of a fine dust, and we end up during the wintertime potentially having more dust emissions because of the type of water we use. And it's kind of funny, because in one of the scenes there, we actually found that mother's milk is the best dust suppressant that can be used. No.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, go, please.
I mean, like that scene, right? Everybody caught that from the scene in the movie, is those guys didn't sufficiently flush their salts out of their soils, which is why the green space is no longer green, right? So that's what Travis was alluding to with the soil, like the downfall of some of past civilizations has been to poor salt management. Yeah.
Do we have to worry about that here?
Yes. The soils in the Moab Valley aren't super salty, right? And so it's less of an issue. But like where Travis was talking to that, so that's why there's like the balance is between flooding them out and not.
Awesome. So after meeting the many mothers and kind of realizing that the green place is no bueno, they decide that they're going to actually turn around and kind of storm the fortress that they left from, because that's really the only place left with clean water. And so they turn around and they go back the way they came, and there are these insane, epic car battles that we're not going to watch here, but you should definitely watch them because they're super cool. There's a lot of landscape degradation. They just destroy everything they go through. And ultimately, they end up killing the evil dictator, and they get to drive back into the fortress victorious. Oh, man. Yeah. Woo! To be honest, all I can really think about of that last scene is, oh my God, that's not the best way to distribute that water. Turn your water off. Okay, so I want to kind of end with two questions that are kind of for the panel, and we can talk about it. First, I want to ask, is this where we're heading? Are we heading in Moab into a Mad Max direction? And then I want to talk about maybe what kind of management options might exist to make sure that we don't go that way. So, Natalie, let's start with you.
I'm just a human. I may be a scientist, but I'm also a human who really wants to just enjoy my life as it is, and not think about these things. But there are a lot of studies suggesting that there will be major changes in vegetation and crust and water availability, but there's also a lot of studies showing that there might just be changes in the communities of plants and crust, and other things may grow that didn't used to grow before. I think major changes in water usage will have to occur in the whole West. And I think that that's starting to be addressed more effectively by the new Colorado River Water Plan. People seem to be taking it more seriously. So, yeah, I don't want to say yes or no. I think it'll take a while for that to happen.
I'm going to say no. Just so I can, not have to, so I can sleep tonight. I mean, there's two parts to it. There's like the water quantity availability for humans and agriculture, right? So that's a big part of the question for us. And then there is how is the desert ecosystem going to respond to the changing climate, and how we're using that landscape. And I think I'm not well versed on the sort of the water quantity for humans and agricultural part of it to know enough. I definitely think we're going to have water shortages based on the forecast. I mean, we read, like Natalie was alluding to, we read papers and we cite papers in our work that talk about this doom and gloom sort of forecast stuff that makes it seem like we're going to have some kind of tipping point in the water quality or quantity availability. But then on the other half, we have our struggles in terms of how we manage our landscape and trying to keep people from busting the crust and keeping drivers on the road. But compared to other places, we're doing pretty good. We were looking at doing a project in Kuwait, so I spent some time in Kuwait, which is a very dry country and has no land management. Literally, if they want to keep people from driving into areas, they have to build like a concertina wire fence, and then that's not enough. They have to build giant earthen barricades to keep people from driving the fence over to get into the little park. So after being here, we're like, oh my God, it's awful. And then you go there, it's like, well, we're actually doing pretty good. We don't have to physically keep people from driving their Jeeps in. They mostly follow the rules. And so I think, we could always do better, but I think we're actually doing pretty good relative to a lot of places.
Yeah, probably just a shameless plug for my project. I've got about 480 acres that I am in control of. So at least for my little spot of land out there, we're doing everything we can for at least the next 10 years. One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later is Mike and his crew. They're coming out and they're doing vegetative studies out there to see what kind of vegetation will grow out there and prevent the kind of dust that we're seeing in this video clip and stuff. So I think at least for that little sphere right there, and then that long term, what becomes of that property? Is that a property that so I've seen the Moab vision for what that site becomes, and there's a lot of good things in there. So if we can make that happen after we get it cleaned up, then at least maybe that little area we can keep as native as it possibly can be.
So I guess, I in large part agree with everybody else. I think it's important to acknowledge that as we move forward with our mostly business as usual climate change policies, and if we don't really look at our land management policies as well, both are factors that increase our probability of desertification and Mad Max-ish scenarios. So although I appreciate the optimism, I also think that realism, it needs to come into the picture. I mean, if you read a lot of the thing that gets me is that it's a lot of high impact, like Science, Nature, all the like big journals, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where a lot of these kind of like mega drought future predictions are coming out. So they're like, from experience, like trying to get something published in that will like pretty much usually like smack you in the face. And so like these are like people, you know, like there's a lot of stuff that like that is out there that does like hint at the risk of it. Now like it's important not to like monger fear and oversell it, because one of the dynamics that played into the Dust Bowl was not just drought. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Dust Bowl, 1930s, people are in the Great Plains, like Oklahoma and stuff, plowing up grasslands for agriculture. Then they get, you know, and they have a very similar precipitation kind of aridity regime to us. Grasslands there are much more resilient than ours to grazing and stuff because they evolved with big grazers. But when you plow it up and you put a drought on top of it. And so what I would highlight is that the potential interaction of both land disturbance and drought does present a significant risk of things changing a lot. We don't know the dynamics of that because we're kind of in uncharted territory a lot with kind of everything we're doing, like the amount of like human impacts and where we're at with our climate. So I'm gonna just throw the other side of the coin from our optimists here that there is probability of it.
I would say optimism that we're not going to look like Mad Max is not overly optimistic. Because Kuwait looks like Mad Max. Like some of the places where they're working there looks like that.
So talk to me about management, and you know we know our managers are trying and they're doing a great job in our region. But tell me what more options might exist as we kind of finish up here.
I think what like Travis is alluding to, I think we have to think about minimizing risk for uncertain futures, and so it's there is a great impetus to try to do something. So for example, back to the Milford Flat Fire example in central Utah, the reason why those people spent, the state and the BLM and others spent $25 million on restoration post-fire is because you really want to do something to make the landscape better. And that caused sort of catastrophic change on the lower elevation. And so I think for some things we have to think about thinking about maybe not doing things, particularly when they come to some of the land treatments, just because of the unknown risks for catastrophic change. And then I think we need to be also thinking about getting the information into those people that are making decisions about the risks associated with the decisions they're making, which we don't often do a good job doing. So when you're making a management plan or thinking about that site-specific information that you need for whether it's your NEPA action or whatever, to be able to really quantify those risks and make those transparent to the public and to the decision makers to avoid sort of the big risk outcomes. Because what happens, and I talked about this earlier, when we move into drier futures or more variable futures, everything becomes more risky, whether it's business as usual or new things that we're doing.
So you're saying all of our policymakers need to come to Science Moab on tap?
Absolutely.
Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, again, just from the project level, I have a little bit of property that we're trying to do everything we can to mitigate dust and also try to re-veg it now. So we've got some time to before we turn it over to whatever entity is going to take it at the end. But a lot of the things we're trying to do is just today we went to the canyon lands and they were going to build some buildings out there, and we were able to salvage a trailer load of plants, native vegetation. So we're planting those on our sites. We're spreading native seed as much as we can. We're working with local experts on native vegetation to at least, again, that small little stamp there that we can do the best job we can now. One of the things that the future land use vision wanted on our site was shade. Moab is lacking in a lot of shade. So we're planting trees, and I know it's controversial because people, once a tree is planted, they don't want to take it down. But you're not going to have a full-grown tree if I don't start planting them now. So it's low cost. It's a good opportunity for us to provide as much shade, reasonably low cost, and then hopefully whoever takes it over will appreciate the shade. and we can go from there. So, and again, I think working with the Geologic Survey and company and trying to figure out, again, we can use our site, because it is restricted, nobody can go there. We can use it as a test bed and see what different things impact different soils and all that. So it's a good opportunity for us to use it as a science bed. We're trying to work with Office of Science within DOE and do some other studies on the migration of uranium in groundwater. That's one thing that right now my treatment is extraction of water and putting it back on the pile, and then we take the pile up to Crest Junction. Well, when I'm done, we don't have an extraction process in place. So either we have to build a plant or we find another way to take care of the residual uranium that may be in the groundwater after we're gone. So I think we've got some opportunities. We've got some time, at least with my site. It's isolated, but I think it's a beautiful area. I love it out there. It's right on the Colorado River. So it's a fun job, and I think we've got some good things that we can accomplish there in the next few years.
All right. Anything else? Oh, man. All right. Let's thank our panelists for this awesome conversation. And thank you all for coming out. This has been amazing. These turnouts just warm our science hearts. And thank the helipad and Helena. And we're going to see you in November for the next winter season of Science on Tap. We'll see you all then.